we begin our study of ecology focusing our attention on populations. Populations are going to be groups of organisms of the same species that are living in the same place at the same time. And this is going to be of interest in biology because we understand that natural selection, the force that helps shape how many organisms look, is going to be acting directly on populations. When you look at how populations change over time and how evolution works, individuals are going to be sometimes not as important, but populations as a whole are going to be able to pass those beneficial characteristics that are desirable for the survival of organisms over to future generations. Therefore, since we're talking about generations and we're talking about groups of organisms, populations will be the simplest level at which we can do that. So again, think about populations as groups of organisms that are meeting three criteria. Number one, they have to be members of the same species. Also, they have to be living in the same place and at the same time. A study of a population, for example, focuses on what a population is doing at a specific time, and it doesn't take into account necessarily organisms that were born in the past, in past years, but have already died, or the organisms that are necessarily going to be part of future populations. So now that we have an idea for what a population is, there are going to be two factors that ecologists will often want to know when it comes to a population. One is going to be how crowded, how many individuals are present in a unit of area where this population exists. That is a measure of a population known as population density. Populations sometimes can be at low density when you have only a few individuals in a large space into which they can potentially move and use resources that may be available. Populations at high density are going to be overcrowded. There's going to be way too many organisms, and sometimes a place may have very little resources left for the members of such an overcrowded population. The other thing that we want to think about is not only the number of individuals, but also the area that a population is going to take. And here we have a little bit of leniency in terms of the ecologist can decide what is the boundaries or what are the boundaries of the populations. And if you think, for example, for someone who's studying the western red cedar trees in the Puget Sound area, for them a population can be just those trees, the western red cedar trees that are found in one backyard or maybe one park. For others, maybe a population will be all of the city or all of the trees that you can find in a county. And the problem here is that the larger the boundaries for the population and more resources and time it would take for studying such a population. I want you to focus your attention, for example, to this example on the screen, and you see all of these monarch butterflies. This photo was taken in a forest in central Mexico where monarch butterflies go and migrate. This is one of those most fascinating migrations of animals in the world, because this group of butterflies, all of them would have been the descendants, sometimes 2 or 3 generations after the ones that made the trip to Mexico on the previous year. And so ecologists go to Mexico every winter, and they want to monitor, they want to follow the number of monarch butterflies that made the trip on that specific winter. So imagine your task. You're looking at trees in a forest, not 1 or 2 or 3, but an entire forest, and there are all of these butterflies, and your task is to count how many butterflies have arrived at this forest in central Mexico. How do you do it? Well, counting them one by one is impossible. You can't do that. There's no ecologist that would recommend you to do such thing. But in order to estimate the size of a population, how many individuals you have, we can use sampling techniques. When we use the word sampling, immediately it should come to mind that we're going to be coming up with an estimate. It is not going to be precisely, exactly to the last individual, that number that is going to be provided, but it's going to be a rounded and approximate figure, a ballpark idea, hopefully a good one, that will tell you how many individuals are present in one place. Now, populations can be sampled differently depending on the type of organism. If you're looking at plants, often ecologists are going to be using what we call a Quadrat sampling method. This, you see here in this picture, is going to be an example of a quadrat. It's like a grid, and there is a specific size. Sometimes they can be like 0.5 meter by 0.5 meter, or 50 centimeters by 50 centimeters. And then what you want to do is create a map of the geographic boundaries for the population, divide that, break that into a grid, and then randomly place these quadrats into various places to come up with an average of how many plants you can count per quadrat. Then the calculation is actually not a very complicated one. Let's say, for example, that you are looking at dandelions that are growing in a park. These plants are going to be abundant during certain times of the year. And so let's say, for example, that the total area of a park that is considered to be where a population is found is going to have 1,000 meter squares, or 1,000 square meters. That is going to be the total area the population can inhabit. I'm hoping you can focus on these numbers I'm writing on the screen right now. And we have a Quadrat, a tool we're using, and the quadrants are going to be only 0.5 meters square, or square meters. In other words, this is a 50 by 50 centimeter. Then after doing this, counting the number of plants, placing it in different randomly selected places of this boundary for the population of dandelions, these little yellow flowers that appear in the spring, we come up with an idea that there are approximately 20 dandelions per square meter. What we have to do is now our calculation. We have a total area of 1,000 square meters. If we multiply that times 20 and divide it by 0.5, we are going to come up with an estimate, the total number of dandelion plants present in one place, at approximately 40,000 of those plants. Now here's the beauty. Did you have to go and count 40,000 dandelion plants? But of course not. Therefore, this sampling technique using quadrats is going to be useful in terms of saving your time and the intensity, how much effort you put into coming up with the average number of plants per square meter is going to be the measure to which you can rely on this estimate. If you're looking at animals that are moving all the time, quadrats will not give you the answer. When animals are moving, they present a challenge, and how do you know which ones you've counted already and which ones you haven't counted before? So with animals, we're going to be using something called mark and recapture method. And here's the idea, and I've done this before with ecology classes in other places where I've taught ecology. We will go with students to a lake, and then we will try to come up with an idea for how many fish are present in that lake. And because this is a population, let's say that we are focusing on the number of fish like the one in this picture. This is going to be a rainbow trout. And so we want to see how many rainbow trout fish in a lake. Then what we would do is, with our best fishing efforts, using a seine or a net, or fishing with an electrode, which is something that requires a lot of resources. You have to have boats, and then you have to be on the boat safely to shock the fish, only briefly just to stun them, then you can scoop them up with a net. You can capture a lot of fish in a relatively short amount of time. On one of those nights, we went tagging fish, and by the way, you can see, I want to use again my laser pointer, you can see the little tag that is placed on a fish. We usually put it right on the side of the dorsal fin. That is going to stay with the fish for the rest of its life. Then On one night, let's say we went out and we ended up with a total of 200 fish, 200 rainbow trout. Then what you do is you mark them and you release them again. Now they are allowed enough time to go and move around, disperse again throughout the lake, and then maybe a month later, you go and do a second catch. And on this second catch, we went and try to get as many fish as we can. Remember, now some of the fish we're capturing are going to have a mark because we've seen them before, we've tagged them before, but others are not going to have that tag. So the total number of fish we get the second time around is going to be 150 fish. Okay? Out of these 150 fish, 50 have been already captured before. And we know we captured them before because now they have that little tag we placed in them. Once again, you do the calculations, you multiply the 200 times 150 and divide that total by 50. And this is going to give you a total of 600. And so we can say that in this lake, we're doing our investigation to study rainbow trout. We are estimating that the number of fish, rainbow trout in that lake is going to be about 600. And so that's how sampling techniques work. That's how ecologists can come up with an idea for how many individuals of a given species live in a certain place. Another interesting factor of populations we want to study is going to be how they are spread out. And as it turns out, in nature, organisms are rarely evenly distributed. Most of the time when you go to a place where organisms are growing and being part of the ecosystem, they are going to be following a clumped distribution. This clumped distribution is going to be usually the result of social interactions. When you think about animals like mammals, where there is usually a matriarchal society where the females are going to be the ones that are going to be the reason many members of the family stay together. Females make many of the important decisions when it comes to elephants. Even in animals like wolves, lions, there's usually this idea there's a dominant male, but the dominant male is usually the right for mating with the females, but the females are the ones that are making the significant decisions for the survival of the population. So because organisms are staying in that social family group that has been established, they will be living in clumps. Sometimes we have this uneven distribution of resources. Look, for example, at this landscape. It's a river cutting through a desert. Away from the desert, vegetation is limited, but right there by the banks of the river, you have trees and you have shrubs, and with all of this plant type of material, there's going to be also the herbivores, the organisms that feed on plants, and with the herbivores will also come the carnivores, those that are feeding on the rodents or the birds or other things that are feeding on the plants. And so for that reason, because of this limited resource, which is water, which is not evenly spread throughout the desert, water only runs on a specific part of the desert, that's where the plants are, that's where the animals are going to be, and so water becomes the reason things are going to become clumped. If you take a picture of planet Earth at nighttime, a picture taken with a satellite, nighttime reveals the places where there's electricity, where there's like city lights shining out into space in the middle of the night. You can see that human populations live in clumps, in clusters, and they are usually going to be found around water, near large rivers, near the ocean, because water is one of those limited resources indispensable for our survival. Another distribution you can find in nature is going to be the uniform distribution. If you look at these gannets, the birds that are nesting in this picture, it may seem to you that they are arranged into like rows, and there's like an even distance between one nest and a nest. By the way, you can see rows this way, diagonally going from the bottom to the top, or you can go across, and the animals seem to be in rows. And I want to assure you that nobody went there with a meter stick measuring, okay, we'll put a nest here, and a nest here, and another nest here. That's not how it happened. So how did these animals end up with this uniform distribution? One of those is resource competition. And here, the most important resource in this picture is nesting space. Sometimes areas that are ideal for nesting are areas where predators have a harder time coming and attacking the young or the parents while they are incubating. And so in this case, because there's a limited amount of nesting space, all these gannets have managed a way to assort themselves in a pretty much even, uniform distribution. Another one is going to be territorial behaviors. And if you look at the distance between one nest and another, is just how far you can be from a neighbor without getting hurt when squabbles, when fights erupt between members of this breeding colony. They will attempt to peck at each other without getting up from the nest, and because of the distance that exists between two of these birds, they may make a lot of noise, but they're not really going to be close enough to land a peck on the opponent. This uniform distribution is really rare in nature. Remember, the most common is the clumped distribution. Second, rare, but still we see it, is this uniform pattern of distribution. The most rare pattern of distribution we find in nature is a random distribution. And the reason this is rare is because there are so many factors that come into play in dynamic environments like a tide pool. And that's exactly what I've chosen for this picture here. You see these sea stars, presumably at low tide. The ocean has retreated, and now we have the sea stars that in order to survive, they have to now be sharing this shallow pool of water with anemones and other organisms. You may see here a few limpets, maybe some hermit crabs. And so they're going to be at one moment all together, all clumped, but the moment that tide returns and the levels of the ocean go back up, they will spread out because they will go in search of mussels or other types of prey that they like to feed on. And so what exactly is the distribution of a sea star? It's really hard to predict. It's going to be sometimes affected by the intensity of the sun, by rainfall at the seashore, all of these factors, but predominantly the level of the tide that will be influencing whether these organisms are spread out or clustered. And so this random distribution is going to be the most rare in nature. I will come back with another video, and there's going to be an entire series on ecology, and I want you to study them all carefully. I will try to keep them short so that you don't have to sit for a long period contemplating one particular topic of population ecology or another. So I'll be back with more.